She was standing in front of the mirror in her wedding dress, one hand resting gently on her stomach, holding the most beautiful secret she had ever kept. She was pregnant, and in less than 6 days, she was going to tell the man she loved, the man she was about to marry, that they were going to be a family. She had imagined the moment 100 times. His face, his laugh, the way he'd pull her close and whisper, "Really? We're really doing this." But that's not what happened. Because that same night, just hours after she stood in that dress, dreaming about their future, she heard something she was never supposed to hear. Her fiancé's voice. Laughing, relaxed, confident. Ava's perfect for the role. Sweet, devoted, and completely clueless. She didn't move. She couldn't. And she has no idea about Brooke. Brooke, her best friend, her maid of honor, the woman who had sat on her bed just hours before, held her hand, and told her how happy she was for her. Ava stood in that hallway, one hand still pressed to her stomach, and she made a decision. She wasn't going to run. She wasn't going to cry. She wasn't going to cancel the wedding. She was going to show up. She was going to walk down that aisle, smile at the man who had played her for a fool, and then, in front of every single person he had ever wanted to impress, she was going to burn his entire world to the ground. Stay with us, because this wedding is about to become something nobody in that room will ever forget. Before we dive deeper, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. And don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. There are moments in a woman's life that she carries forever, not because they were the loudest or the most dramatic, but because they were the ones that divided everything into before and after. The first time she falls genuinely in love, not infatuation, not convenience, but the kind of love that reorganizes the way she sees herself and the world she moves through. The day she realizes that love is real, that it has chosen her specifically, that it intends to stay. In the morning, she holds a small white stick in a trembling hand and watches 2 pink lines appear side by side and understands, in a single breathless moment, that the future she had been imagining has just expanded in ways she could not have planned. For Ava Calloway, all 3 of those moments arrived within the same 6-day window, and not one of them ended the way she had dreamed it would. That is the thing about the stories we tell ourselves about our lives. We build them carefully, lovingly, with all the hope and intention we have available to us. And sometimes, the universe sends something through the middle of what we have built, and we are left standing in the wreckage of it, trying to understand how something that felt so solid could have been so thoroughly hollow. Ava was 31 years old, born and raised in Charlotte, North Carolina, a city that carries the particular warmth of the American South without leaning too hard into it, a city of wide residential streets and old church steeples, and an energy that feels both ambitious and grounded at the same time. She was the youngest of 3 children, the daughter of a retired high school principal named Robert Calloway and a retired nurse named Sandra, who had spent 40 years showing up for other people and raised her children with the understanding that showing up was not a sacrifice. It was simply who you were supposed to be. The Calloway household was not wealthy, but it was full of laughter, full of arguments that resolved before dinner, full of the specific kind of love that comes from people who have decided, daily and deliberately, to choose each other. Ava had absorbed all of it. She had grown up believing that love was something you built with your hands over a long time, not something that arrived already finished. That belief had shaped her in ways both beautiful and, as it turned out, costly. She had moved to Atlanta at 24, chasing a career in brand marketing that felt equal parts exciting and terrifying when you were loading your life into a 10-year-old Honda at 6 in the morning while your mother stood on the front porch in her robe pretending not to cry. Atlanta received her the way cities receive ambitious young women, with indifference at first, then, slowly, with opportunity. She had clawed her way into a marketing position at a mid-sized firm downtown, then worked her way up over 5 years to a senior strategist role that she was genuinely proud of, the kind of proud that isn't about the title, but about the work itself, about knowing that what you produce is good. She had built herself a life in Atlanta piece by piece, an apartment with tall windows in the old Fourth Ward, a circle of friends she had earned through the slow and deliberate work of being present for people, a routine that felt like hers in the specific and satisfying way that a life you have built yourself always does. She had been happy in the quiet and competent way that a woman who has made peace with her own company pretends to be happy. And then, at a rooftop event in Buckhead on a warm Thursday evening in October, she had met Dylan Carter, and the happiness she had built became the foundation for something she believed was going to be even larger. Dylan Carter was the kind of man who entered a room and rearranged it simply by being there. Tall, sharp-jawed, dressed with the effortless precision of someone who had learned long ago that appearance was one of the first tools of power and had decided to master it without looking like he'd tried. He was 34 years old, a commercial real estate developer whose grandfather had founded a small property management firm in Marietta in the 1970s and whose father had grown it moderately before Dylan arrived and grew it aggressively, bringing in investors, diversifying the portfolio, expanding into commercial development in a way that attracted attention from people whose attention mattered. He was the kind of man who had been told he was exceptional from an early age and had put in enough genuine work to feel justified in believing it. He was confident without the performance of confidence, which is rarer than people think. When he crossed the rooftop and handed Ava a glass of the exact wine she had been about to order, it was not a calculated move. Or rather, it was, but it was executed with such ease that the calculation was invisible, and that invisibility was itself a skill he had cultivated over many years of understanding how people worked and what they responded to. They dated for 2 years before he proposed. 2 years of weekend trips to Savannah and the kind of slow Sunday mornings that feel like a promise about what the rest of your life could look like. 2 years of Tuesday evening dinners in their own kitchen because they had claimed Tuesday as their night, deliberately and early, carving out a small domestic ritual that felt like the beginning of something lasting. Dylan was attentive in those early months in ways that felt real, in ways that Ava had no reason to question. He remembered the name of her college roommate. He remembered that she took her coffee with oat milk and exactly 1 sugar, not 2. He remembered the anniversary of her father's first health scare and texted her that morning without being reminded. He asked questions and listened to the answers and followed up on things she had mentioned weeks before, the way people do when they are genuinely paying attention to you. Ava had built her life on the belief that love was something you built slowly and carefully, and here was a man who seemed to understand that, who seemed to be building it with her, brick by careful brick. The proposal came on the rooftop where they had met. String lights, a musician playing softly, the Atlanta skyline spread below them like an exhibit of everything that was possible. He had gotten down on one knee and said, "I have been looking for a home my entire life, and I found it in you." She had said yes before the sentence was finished. The night had felt like a beginning, and in a way it was, just not the kind she thought. Brooke Daniels had been Ava's best friend for 9 years, which is long enough that the friendship had stopped feeling like something they had chosen and had started feeling like something they simply were, a fixed point in both their lives, as reliable as weather patterns, as assumed as gravity. They had met at a charity 5K in Atlanta on a cold February morning when both of them were 22 years old, both significantly underprepared for the distance, and both finishing at the back of the pack with the specific combination of breathlessness and laughter that comes when you have tried something and failed at it in good company. They had ended up at a coffee shop around the corner from the finish line and talked for 3 hours straight about their jobs, their families, their ambitions, the particular loneliness of being a young woman building a life in a city that doesn't know your name yet. By the time the coffee was cold, they had exchanged numbers and made plans for the following weekend. 9 years later, Ava was still keeping those plans. That was the kind of friendship it had always been, the kind built on showing up consistently, on being genuinely interested in the other person's life, on accumulating enough shared history that you stopped having to explain the background of every story because the other person already knew it. Brooke was a physical therapist. She worked at a rehabilitation center in Midtown, the kind of place that served everyone from professional athletes recovering from surgery to elderly patients relearning how to walk after a stroke. She was good at her job in the specific way that people are good at things that require both technical skill and genuine human warmth. She understood bodies the way she understood people, with attention and patience and a refusal to give up on someone simply because their progress was slow. She was funny in the sharp, quick way that catches people off guard, the kind of funny that makes you spit out your drink at dinner when you weren't ready for it. She was the friend who arrived with wine when you hadn't asked for company, who remembered the names of your difficult coworkers and asked follow-up questions weeks later, who could walk into a room where the mood was low and shift it without trying. Ava had loved these things about her completely and without reservation. The way you love the qualities in a person that you most want reflected back at you. The warmth, the loyalty, the ability to show up exactly as they are and make that feel like a gift. Over 9 years, Brooke had been present for every significant moment of Ava's adult life. She had been the one who drove Ava to the emergency room at 2 in the morning when her father had his first cardiac event, who sat in the waiting room for 4 hours with her without once checking her phone in a way that suggested she wished she were somewhere else. She had been there through the career disappointments, the promotion that went to someone less qualified, the client pitch that Ava had spent 3 weeks preparing for that fell apart in the room. Sitting across from her at the kitchen table and offering the specific combination of sympathy and practical strategy that Ava needed most. She had been there through the difficult relationship that preceded Dylan, a 2-year involvement with a man who was emotionally withholding in ways that Ava hadn't fully understood until Brooke had named it plainly and clearly over dinner one evening. He makes you feel like you have to earn something that should be freely given. That's not love. That's a toll booth. Ava had ended that relationship within the month. She had always trusted Brooke's read on things. She had trusted it so completely, for so long, that she had never once considered what it might cost her if that trust had been misplaced. When Dylan proposed, Brooke was the first person Ava called. She had barely made it out of the elevator of the building where they had gotten engaged before her phone was in her hand and Brooke's number was ringing. The conversation had been one of the happiest of Ava's adult life. Brooke's voice going high with genuine-sounding delight. The plans they made in that single phone call already beginning to take shape. The shared excitement of 2 women who had been friends long enough to understand that each other's milestones were their own. Brooke had agreed immediately and without hesitation to be maid of honor. She had thrown Ava a bridal shower that was thoughtful in every detail. Not flashy, not performative, but specific to who Ava was, full of the small touches that told you someone knew you well enough to translate that knowing into a party. She had been present at every dress appointment, every venue walkthrough, every decision that required a second opinion from someone whose opinion Ava trusted. She had been, in every observable way, exactly the friend she had always been, which made what she was doing behind that friendship, simultaneously and without apparent guilt, one of the most complete betrayals that Ava would ever have to make sense of. The psychology of dual betrayal. Losing a romantic partner and a best friend through the same act of deception has been studied with increasing seriousness over the past 2 decades, as researchers began to understand that the compounded nature of the loss does not simply double the pain, but creates a qualitatively different kind of damage. A 2019 study published in the Journal of Social and Personal Relationships found that women who experienced what researchers called conjoint betrayal, the simultaneous loss of both a romantic partner and a close female friend, reported significantly higher levels of what the study described as trust collapse than women who had experienced either betrayal and isolation. Trust collapse is not simply distrust of the specific individuals who betrayed you. It is a broader and more destabilizing condition in which your confidence in your own ability to read people, to understand who is safe and who is not, to know the difference between genuine care and performed care, is fundamentally shaken. You stop trusting your perceptions. You begin to question your memories. You wonder what else you have been wrong about, how many other performances you have accepted as real, how many other rooms you have been standing outside of without knowing what was being said inside them. That is what Brooke and Dylan gave Ava, together, through 4 months of active and sustained deception. Not just heartbreak, a fracture in the foundations of how she understood the world. There is something profoundly private about the first days of knowing you are pregnant. Before the appointments and the announcements and the reorganizing of a life around a new life. Before any of that, there is a window of time, sometimes hours, sometimes days, when the knowledge exists only inside you. When you are the sole keeper of something that feels both enormous and impossibly delicate, like holding a flame in cupped hands and knowing that the wrong breath in the wrong direction could change it. Ava Calloway had entered that window 2 days before everything fell apart. She had taken the test alone on a Tuesday morning in the apartment she and Dylan shared, not because she had suspected anything, but because her body had been telling her something quietly for a week, and she had learned, over the years, to listen to her body when it spoke quietly. She had sat on the edge of the bathtub for a long time with the test in both hands, not moving, not speaking, just being present with the information while the city moved on outside the window with complete indifference to what had just changed inside that room. She was pregnant. The word sat in her mind with a weight that was different from any word she had held before, heavier than she expected, and at the same time filled with a lightness that contradicted the weight, the way only the most significant things manage to be both things at once. She pressed both palms flat against her stomach, below the soft fabric of her sleep shirt, and she thought the simplest possible thought. Hello. Just that. Hello. Because it was the beginning of a conversation she intended to keep going for the rest of her life. The joy that moved through her in that moment was not complicated. It did not ask permission. It arrived fully formed and unambiguous, the way genuine joy tends to do when it finds a person who is ready for it. She had always wanted children, not in the abstract, performative way that people sometimes claim when they're trying to project a certain kind of readiness, but in the specific and personal way, the way of someone who had spent years thinking about the kind of mother she intended to be, what she would do differently from what had been done for her, and what she would carry forward with gratitude. She knew what kind of mother she was going to be. She had been preparing for it without quite realizing she was doing so, the way the most important preparations in a life tend to happen. She had decided to wait to tell Dylan, to hold the secret through the final days of wedding preparation and choose her moment carefully, the way she approached everything that mattered to her, with deliberateness, with attention, with a desire to give the moment its full weight. She had imagined the telling so many times in those 2 days that it had acquired the quality of a memory, even though it hadn't happened yet, the vividness of something you have rehearsed until it feels real. She had pictured their wedding night, the room quiet after the celebration, the two of them alone for the first time as husband and wife with the good fatigue of the day settled over both of them. She would pour champagne, hand him a small envelope, watch his face as he read the card she had already written and sealed and placed in the inside pocket of her overnight bag. She had written it on Monday, the day before she took the test, when she had been almost certain but not yet sure, in the particular way that a woman's body communicates things to her that her mind hasn't quite caught up with. The card said, "By the time you read this, you are already a father. I cannot wait to do this with you." She had sealed it and put it away and carried the knowledge of it around for 2 days like a gift she was saving for the right moment. A gift she believed, with absolute certainty, was going to be one of the most welcome things she had ever given another person. What she could not have known was that 2 days later, standing in a hallway in a silk robe, she would understand that the gift had been prepared for someone who did not exist, or rather, for a version of someone that had never existed outside the story she had been telling herself. The card would remain sealed in her overnight bag for 3 more days before she found it, unopened, during the quiet and gutting process of dismantling the life she had been building. She would sit with it in her hands for a long time, and then she would open it herself, read the words she had written, and understand that they were still true, just not in the way she had intended. The physical experience of those 2 days, carrying the pregnancy secretly through the final rush of pre-wedding preparations, had its own particular texture. She had attended a final catering walkthrough and tasted sauces and nodded and made decisions, all while something enormous lived quietly inside her that no one in the room could see. She had sat across from Brooke at a coffee shop and talked about seating arrangements and the timeline for the rehearsal dinner, and Brooke had reached across the table and squeezed her hand and said, "You look glowing." And Ava had laughed and said it was the new face cream she was using, and both of those things had felt entirely ordinary in a moment that was, beneath its surface, anything but. She had called her mother that evening, and they had talked for an hour about the wedding, and Ava had held the secret back with a discipline that cost her something, because she wanted to tell her mother more than she wanted to tell almost anyone. But she had decided Dylan first, and she kept that decision. She had gone to bed that night with her hand on her stomach and thought about the future with a confidence so complete and so uncomplicated that it would, in the days that followed, feel almost like a different person's memory, almost like something that had happened to someone else. But it had happened to her, and she had been entirely, completely real in the middle of it. That is the part that matters, not the part where everything broke, the part where she had been genuinely, fully happy. That happened. Nothing that came after could reach back and take it away. Every person who has ever been deceived by someone they loved has had to eventually sit with a version of the same impossible question. Were there signs? Were there moments when the truth was available to me and I did not take it? Was I naive? Or was I simply trusting in the way that love asks you to be trusting? The way that genuine care requires a willingness to believe in the person you have given it to? That question does not have a clean answer, because the people who are most skilled at sustained deception are precisely the ones who understand how to manage the evidence. They know what to show and what to hide. They know how to pace the performance so that it never overwhelms the audience. And they know, most critically, how to read the person they are deceiving and give them exactly enough of what they need to keep their doubts quiet. Dylan Carter was skilled at this. He had been practicing it, in various forms, for a long time. The portrait of him that emerged in the weeks after the wedding, through conversations with people who had known him before Ava, through information that Jesse quietly gathered, through the natural process by which a man's real character becomes visible once the performance he was maintaining has publicly collapsed, was of a person who had learned very early that the world responded to presentation, that what you appeared to be was often more powerful than what you actually were, and that most people, given a sufficiently convincing performance, would not look behind it. He had grown up in a household that valued success visibly. His father, Grant Carter, was a man whose self-worth was closely tied to the markers of achievement that other people could observe: the car in the driveway, the club membership, the children's accomplishments as they could be reported to other people. He was not cruel, exactly. He was absent in a particular way that is sometimes harder to name than cruelty. The way of a man who is physically present but emotionally elsewhere, who attends the events but does not show up for the moments between them. Dylan had learned, from a young age, that his father's attention was connected to his performance. That when he won, his father noticed. That when he struggled, his father became busy. The lesson that a child absorbs from that dynamic, the lesson that is written into the body before it is understood by the mind, is that love is conditional and approval is the currency that purchases it. Dylan had spent his adult life accumulating that currency and distributing it strategically. He was generous with his approval of others when it served him. He was charming because charm was useful. He was attentive in the early stages of relationships because attentiveness produced loyalty, and loyalty was something he valued as an asset rather than as an emotional connection. Jesse, who had grown up in the same house with a different sensitivity to it, had seen this about his brother for a long time. He had never said it in those terms. Not to anyone. Not until the night in the diner when everything was already irreversible. But he had felt the shape of it for years. He had watched Dylan move through relationships with a fluency that, from the outside, looked like emotional intelligence, but from the inside looked more like management. He had watched his brother cultivate the appearance of depth without ever quite committing to the reality of it. He had, more than once, experienced the particular sadness of watching someone he cared about, a girlfriend of Dylan's, a business partner, eventually Ava, extend genuine trust to his brother and receive a performance of reciprocity in return. He had told himself, each time, that he was reading things wrong, that his own complicated feelings about his father and about Dylan's favoritism in the family were coloring his perception, that he was being uncharitable to his brother in a way that was more about his own unresolved history than about Dylan's actual behavior. He had wanted to be wrong about Dylan. He had been hoping, when Dylan proposed to Ava and the engagement began and the wedding was planned, that this time was different, that the commitment of marriage had done something to his brother that love alone had not. He had not been wrong. And that knowledge, sitting in the diner at 1 a.m. across from Ava, carried its own specific weight. What Dylan had with Brooke was not, by his own description, a love affair. It was a recreational arrangement that had outlasted its intended duration, sustained by the ease of access and the specific pleasure of an ongoing deception that he appeared to find genuinely satisfying. This is not uncommon in the psychology of narcissistic infidelity. Researchers who study patterns of sustained cheating in high-functioning, high-performing individuals consistently find that the deception itself can become part of the appeal. The maintenance of the secret, the successful management of two simultaneous realities, the ongoing proof of one's own ability to control a complex situation. These things provide their own form of reward, particularly for people whose sense of self is heavily tied to their competence and their ability to manage outcomes. Dylan was not cheating on Ava because he was unhappy with her. He was cheating on Ava because the version of himself that could do so successfully was a version he found compelling. He was, in the most precise sense, in love with his own performance. And Ava, in his framing of things, was not a person whose feelings were a real constraint on that performance. She was a prop within it. That understanding, when it eventually arrived at its full clarity, was the thing that hurt the most. Not that she had not been loved enough. That she had been seen as something other than a person entirely. The 14 months of wedding planning had been, for Ava, some of the happiest of her adult life. That is the thing that people sometimes struggle to understand about situations like this. The happiness was real. It was not a delusion in the clinical sense, not a construction that a careful observer could have identified as false if they had been watching closely enough. It was genuine joy, genuinely felt, genuinely shared with the people around her in ways that produced real memories and real laughter and real warmth. The dress fittings, the venue visits, the long evenings with her mother looking at floral arrangements on a laptop, while Sandra Calloway expressed her opinions on hydrangeas with the confidence of a woman who has waited years for this moment. All of it was real. The bridal shower Brooke had thrown her, the bachelorette weekend in Nashville, the rehearsal dinner planning that had consumed 3 weeks of her evenings. Real. The phone calls with Dylan from business trips where he had asked, with what she had taken for genuine interest, how the planning was going and what she needed from him. Real. She had been building something, completely and wholeheartedly, that she believed was also being built by the people on the other side of it. She had been wrong about the people. She had not been wrong about the building. The care she put in was hers. It still was. In the final weeks before the wedding, the pace of everything had accelerated in the way it always does when a large event is close. The decisions becoming more frequent, the details demanding more attention, the emotional temperature of every interaction rising slightly, because the stakes felt higher now, the margin for error felt narrower, and the significance of what was approaching was making itself felt in ways that were exciting and exhausting in equal measure. Ava had been handling all of it with the particular competence that came naturally to her, the same methodical attention she brought to her work, the same ability to hold multiple threads simultaneously without dropping any of them. She had been, by every external measure, a bride in full command of her wedding and in full happiness about the life she was about to begin. The people around her had experienced her that way. Her mother, her sisters, her colleagues who had celebrated with her at the office when the engagement was announced, the friends who had watched her with Dylan at parties and told each other, quietly, that those two seemed genuinely right for each other. Everyone had seen what Ava had experienced, a woman walking toward a happy ending she had earned. No one had looked behind it. There was nothing visible to look behind. Dylan had been that careful. Brooke had been that skilled. And Ava had been that trusting. Trusting in the way that you are when you have been given no reason not to be, when the evidence before you has been curated by people who understood exactly which evidence to show and which to keep hidden. There had been small things, if she looked back carefully enough. And in the days after the hallway, she did look back carefully. She could not help it. The mind does this when it has been ambushed. It goes back through everything it has stored and re-examines it through the lens of what it now knows, looking for the moments it missed. She found them. Not many, but enough. A Saturday evening 3 months before the wedding when Dylan had come home from a client dinner, with a particular energy she couldn't quite name at the time, not guilty, exactly, but contained, like a man who had decided what was visible and was managing the border carefully. An afternoon when she had reached for his phone to check the time, and he had reached it first, just a half-second before her, and handed it to her unlocked with an ease that was so practiced it had looked natural. A conversation she had overheard through the kitchen wall, his voice low, the kind of low that is about privacy rather than volume, that had stopped when she opened the door, replaced immediately by a smile, and it just wrapping up a call, sorry. She had filed each of these away in the place where people in love put the things they are not ready to examine. She had told herself the things you tell yourself, that she trusted him, that all relationships had textures, that the demands of his work had always made him occasionally guarded and distracted, and that this was a known quality she had accepted. She had chosen to keep building, and that choice had not been stupidity. It had been love. The two things can look identical from the outside, and the difference between them is something you often cannot know until after it is over. It was a Wednesday night, 11 days before the end of June, 5 days before the wedding that 212 people had been invited to attend. The city outside the apartment was doing what cities do in late June, humming with summer warmth, the kind of heat that lingers into the evening and makes the air feel dense and alive. Ava had come back from the final dress fitting that afternoon, the one where everything was confirmed perfect and the seamstress had put down her pins and said, with genuine satisfaction, "You're done. You're absolutely ready." And Ava had stood in the fitting room in $1,400 worth of lace and pearl embroidery and felt the full reality of what was 5 days away move through her in a wave. She had changed into her robe after dinner. She had washed her face. She had stood in the bathroom for a moment with her palms on the sink, looking at herself in the mirror, and she had thought, in 5 days I will be his wife. In 5 days we will have started something permanent. She had thought about the card in her overnight bag. She had thought about her baby. She had gone to get a glass of water from the kitchen, moving quietly through the apartment in the particular silence of late evening. And she had passed the hallway where the light was on under the door of Dylan's office, and the voices had reached her before she had made the decision about whether to keep walking. She stopped because something in Dylan's voice was wrong. Not wrong in a way she could have named in that moment. It was more instinctive than articulate, the way the body sometimes registers information that the conscious mind has not yet processed. There was a looseness in it, a comfort, a particular kind of ease that she associated with Dylan when he believed he was entirely unobserved. The door was not fully closed. It rested an inch, perhaps 2 inches, open, the kind of gap that old apartment doors settle into when frames have shifted slightly over years of use. She stood outside it in her silk robe and her bare feet, and she listened, because the first words she caught had her name in them. And when you hear your own name in a conversation you were not supposed to hear, you do not walk away. You stay. Ava's perfect for the role, Dylan said. Not, Ava's perfect. The role. That word. Role. Like she was a casting choice rather than a person. Like the relationship was a production he was directing and she had landed the lead by meeting the requirements. Sweet, devoted, and completely clueless. She heard Marcus's response, something low and appreciative, the sound of a man who finds this impressive rather than troubling. She's beautiful, sure, Dylan continued. Smart enough to be interesting, but not enough to question things. A trophy wife. The kind that makes me look good at the right table. Every word arriving with the clarity of a room where no one is trying to be quiet. And then Marcus said, and she has no idea about Brooke. The silence that followed that sentence, the beat before Dylan's response, was perhaps 3 seconds long. Ava would later think about those 3 seconds often. About what it would have meant if Dylan had paused in a way that suggested regret. If his response had carried any weight of it, any trace of conflict. He did not pause in that way. He laughed. The laugh of a man who finds a situation satisfying rather than complicated. He said that it had started about 4 months ago. He said it had been meant to be a one-time thing. He said Brooke was addictive in the particular tone of a man sharing a personal triumph. He talked about the prenup, the plan to present it to Ava after the wedding as something financial and practical, to get her signature while she was still in the warm and trusting days of being newly married, when she would not be thinking about what a prenup was designed to protect. He talked about what would happen when he got bored, not if, when, and what that exit would look like. Marcus made a sound at some point that might have been a mild protest. Dylan answered it with something dismissive. And then he said the sentence that would echo through every quiet moment of Ava's life for months afterward. If she ever found out, she'd break like a porcelain doll. She worships the ground I walk on. It was too easy. Ava stood in the hallway for another few seconds after that. She stood there not because she was frozen, but because something in her needed to be absolutely certain. Needed the full and unambiguous weight of what she was hearing to settle into her bones so that she could never, in the weeks and months ahead, talk herself into the possibility that she had misheard or misunderstood. She had not misheard. She had not misunderstood. She turned and walked back down the hallway, and the apartment was quiet enough that her bare feet made no sound on the floor, and Dylan kept talking in the room behind her, and she reached the bedroom and closed the door without making a sound, and then her legs gave way. She did not sob immediately. That is the thing about true shock. It has a quality of silence to it at first, a stillness that comes before the body catches up with what the mind has just absorbed. She slid down the back of the bedroom door and sat on the floor with her knees pulled toward her and both hands pressed over her mouth, and she breathed, carefully, in and out, with the concentration of someone trying to keep a structure from collapsing. The apartment was quiet around her. She could faintly hear the continued murmur of voices from down the hallway. Dylan still talking, still easy, still entirely unbothered. And that sound, the normalcy of it, the absolute absence in it of any awareness that his world had just fundamentally changed, was somehow the worst thing. He did not know. He was sitting in that room with his whiskey and his best man and his careful, satisfied plans, and he did not know that she knew. And the entire architecture of what he had built, the role he had cast her in, the performance she had been delivering unknowingly for 2 years, the production he had been directing from behind the set, had just collapsed on the inside while the outside still held. She pressed her back against the door and let her hands fall into her lap, and she looked at the ceiling of the bedroom they shared, the bedroom she had chosen the furniture for, where her wedding dress was hanging in a garment bag on the back of the closet door, and she allowed herself, for the first time, to feel the full size of what had happened to her. It came in waves, the way significant pain does, not all at once, but in rolling surges that each brought a different component of the whole. The first wave was grief, pure, clean grief for the relationship she had believed she was in, for the 2 years she had given to something that had been, at least in part, a construction. The second wave was the particular quality of pain that belongs to betrayal by a best friend, which is different from romantic betrayal and sits in a different part of the body, higher, somewhere behind the sternum, with a quality of disbelief that is almost physical. Brooke, 9 years. The bridal shower, the dress fittings, the coffee shop conversation about seating charts where Brooke had reached across the table and squeezed her hand. The third wave brought her hands to her stomach. The baby, the child she was carrying, whose father had just described its mother as completely clueless, as a trophy, as an investment he intended to liquidate when the return stopped being worth his time. She sat on that floor for a long time. She let herself feel all of it, the grief, the rage, the disorientation, the particular loneliness of being a person whose entire immediate circle of trust has just been revealed as something other than what she thought it was. She did not fight the feelings or try to move past them before they were ready to move. That was something she understood about herself, something she had learned over the years of working through difficult things, that feelings which are pushed down before they are processed do not go away. They become subterranean and they cost more later. So she sat with it. She felt it fully. She let it be as large as it was. And then, at some point that she could not have timed exactly, but that came the way these things come, slowly, like a tide that reverses without announcing itself, the grief began to change shape. It did not diminish. It transformed. It became something harder and colder and far more focused. She thought about the words, porcelain doll. She turned them over in her mind, deliberately, the way you handle something sharp to understand exactly where its edges are. Porcelain. Fragile. Breakable. Something you handle carefully because it cannot survive a fall. He had looked at her warmth, her trust, her love for him, all the genuine things she had brought to this relationship, and he had seen fragility. He had seen something that would shatter when he dropped it. He was already planning to drop it. He just had a schedule in mind. She pulled herself off the floor. She walked to the bathroom. She ran the cold water and pressed her wet hands to her face. And when she looked up at the mirror, the woman looking back at her was someone she recognized completely and without confusion. There are 2 kinds of decisions that a person makes in the course of a life. The first kind is deliberative. You gather information, you weigh options, you consult people, you arrive at a conclusion through a process that takes time and leaves a record. The second kind is different. It arrives whole. It does not ask to be weighed. It simply presents itself with the particular authority of something that was already true before you found the language for it. And you recognize it the way you recognize your own handwriting. Standing in the bathroom at 12:20 in the morning, looking at her own face in the mirror, Ava made the second kind of decision. She was not going to run. She had considered it. She stood there, and she turned the idea of running over carefully and gave it its full honest consideration. She could leave before sunrise. She had the savings. She had her car, her phone, the freedom of a woman who had built her own life and therefore knew that the scaffolding was hers. She could be in Charlotte by mid-morning. sitting at her mother's kitchen table with a cup of coffee in her hands, beginning the long and difficult and entirely survivable work of dismantling this chapter and building the next one. She could do it. She was capable of it. But she stood there and she thought about what that would give Dylan Carter. He would wake up in the morning and she would be gone. He would make calls. He would manage the narrative. He would tell people, his investors, his colleagues, the carefully assembled audience of 212 guests, whatever version of the story most protected his image. He would frame her absence as instability. He would be sympathetic and slightly burdened, and he would move forward, as he had always planned to, into whatever came next. He would never have to stand in a room full of people and be fully seen. She would not give him that. She stood in the bathroom and made the decision that changed the shape of everything that followed. And it was not made from bitterness, or not only from bitterness. It was made from something deeper and more architectural than bitterness. It was made from the understanding that a woman who disappears in the night gives the man she disappears from the right to write the ending. She was not going to let Dylan Carter write her ending. She was going to write it herself, in front of every person he had ever curated as an audience for his own success. She would walk into the wedding on Saturday. She would be the bride he expected her to be, graceful, devoted, giving him no indication in the days between now and then that anything had changed. She would let him believe he had won. And then, at the altar, in the specific and irreversible public setting that he had chosen for himself, the room full of investors and clients and colleagues whose good opinion he had spent years managing, she would give him the truth. Not her truth, his truth, in his own words, in his own voice, delivered to his own audience. She would let the room hear him the way she had heard him, and she would walk out of it with her dignity and her child and the rest of her life intact. She turned off the bathroom light and sat on the edge of the bed and picked up her phone. She scrolled until she found the name she needed. Jesse Carter, Dylan's younger brother. The only person in Dylan's orbit who had never once given her a reason to doubt him. Jesse Carter was 29 years old and, by almost every observable measure, the opposite of his brother. Where Dylan had inherited the family's drive for acquisition, the hunger for growth, for status, for the visible markers of success that their father had always treated as the primary language of worth, Jesse had inherited something that the Carter household did not particularly value or know what to do with, which was a conscience. He was a high school history teacher at a public school in Decatur, the kind of teacher that students returned to visit years after graduation not because the class was easy, but because something in it had mattered to them. Something in the way he taught history not as a sequence of events, but as a record of choices, of people in impossible situations deciding what kind of person they were going to be. He lived in a small house he was slowly renovating himself, drove a truck that was 8 years old, and had a dent in the passenger door from a parking lot incident he had never bothered to fix, and spent his summers coaching a youth baseball league in his neighborhood. He was, in the way of people who have found the thing they are actually for, genuinely content. Not in the settled and slightly defeated way, not in the way of someone who has given up on larger ambitions, but in the clear and specific way of someone who looks at their life each morning and recognizes it as their own. He had always been kind to Ava. From the first family event where she had met the extended Carter family, a 4th of July barbecue at his parents' house in Marietta, 3 months after she and Dylan started dating, Jesse had been the person she felt most comfortable with. He asked her actual questions, not the polite, surface-level inquiries that people make at family gatherings when they are trying to establish enough pleasantry to move on, but questions that indicated he had thought about her as a person and was genuinely interested in her answers. He remembered things she mentioned. He asked follow-up questions at the next gathering, the way a person does when they listen the first time and the information stayed with them. He had the quality, rare in men who have grown up alongside a more dominant sibling, of making the people around him feel like they were worth paying attention to. Ava had always thought, quietly, that she was lucky to be gaining Jesse as a brother-in-law. She had imagined their children growing up with him as an uncle, the kind of uncle who would teach them things, who would take them seriously, who would be present in the ways that counted rather than the ways that were visible. She had not known, in those imagined futures, that Jesse was going to play an entirely different role than the one she had pictured, a harder and more necessary one. He arrived at the diner on Ponce de Leon in 14 minutes. Ava had been counting, not because the time mattered, but because focus on something concrete was one way to keep the inside of her from spinning beyond what she could manage. He was wearing dark jeans and a faded Georgia Tech sweatshirt that she suspected he had pulled on in the dark, and his hair was slightly flattened on one side in the way that hair looks when a person has been asleep for a couple of hours. He came through the door, scanning the room immediately, with the focused efficiency of someone who had been prepared to be worried and was now proceeding directly to the source of it. When his eyes found her in the back corner booth, something in his face shifted, the bracing quality relaxing slightly, replaced by something more concentrated, the expression of a person who is now fully present and fully committed to whatever the next few hours are going to require. He slid into the booth across from her. He did not say anything immediately. He looked at her face, at the redness around her eyes, at the particular stillness she was carrying, at the hands wrapped around the cold cup of tea, and he waited. He was very good at waiting. It was one of the things that made him a good teacher, and it was what made him, in this specific and unrepeatable moment, exactly the right person for her to have called. She told him everything. She told him slowly and completely, beginning with the hallway and moving through every word she had heard, every inflection, every specific phrase that she had committed to memory with the precision that the mind applies to things it knows it will need. She watched his face as she spoke. She watched him go very still when she got to the part about Brooke, a stillness that was different from the stillness before it, the particular quality of a person absorbing something that confirms a thing they had already suspected and that they are only now allowing themselves to fully receive. She watched his jaw set and his hands, which had been resting loose on the table, close slowly into fists. When she told him about the prenup plan, the intention to present it after the wedding, the casual framing of the marriage as an acquisition, something moved across his face that she recognized as shame, the specific shame of someone who knows that their own inaction has contributed to a harm they are now witnessing. He looked at her directly when she finished. He said, "I should have talked to you before this. I saw things. I told myself I was reading them wrong." He did not offer more explanation than that. He did not ask her to make him feel better about it. He simply acknowledged it and moved forward. "Tell me what you're thinking," he said. And when she told him, he did not hesitate. He was in. They sat in that diner for 2 hours. The late-night crowd moved around them, a college student at the counter with a laptop, a group of young men in the back who had clearly been out and were now processing the evening over plates of eggs, the particular anonymous comfort of a 24-hour place that asks nothing of you except your order. Ava and Jesse talked in the low, deliberate way of two people who understand that what they are building needs to be solid. Not reckless, not reactive. Solid. Ava had come with a framework already forming, the broad architecture of what she wanted to do and what outcome she needed it to produce. But Jesse had things she didn't, specific knowledge of Dylan's professional relationships, an understanding of which people in that room would be most significant as witnesses, access to channels of information that Ava could not reach without raising suspicion. Together they began to build something real. Ava would continue as normal. She would go home tonight and go to bed and get up in the morning and proceed through the final 5 days of wedding preparation with the same warmth and certainty she had been projecting for the past 14 months. She would answer Brooke's texts. She would attend the rehearsal dinner. She would smile at Dylan across every table and hold his hand in every public moment and give him absolutely nothing that could suggest to either of them that anything had changed. She was going to perform her own role for 5 more days, with full knowledge of what it was, and when she stepped out of it on Saturday, it was going to be in a room that could not be managed or explained away. Jesse's contributions were specific and practical. He had access to the wedding weekend group thread, the coordination channel that included him as a groomsman, that included the venue's event manager, that contained threads where logistics had been shared and where, embedded in those logistics, were the scheduling details he would need. He knew the name of the audio technician who was handling the venue's sound system, a man he had worked with at a school fundraiser the previous spring who owed him a small and unremarkable favor. He knew which of Dylan's professional contacts were attending the wedding and what their relationship with Dylan meant in terms of consequence, which investors were in early enough that a public revelation would matter to them, which clients had been personally courted by Dylan in ways that his real character would retroactively reframe. He knew his brother well enough to understand what Dylan valued most, which was not the relationship, not even the money, but the image, the carefully constructed public presentation of himself as a man of substance and reliability and good judgment. That image was what they were going to touch. That was where it would hurt most precisely. The audio recording was Jesse's idea. He thought about it quietly for several minutes after Ava had outlined what she wanted to happen at the altar, the confrontation, the exposure, the witnesses, and then he said, "He's going to try to deny it. He's going to say you misunderstood or misheard, and some people will believe him because they'll want to." He tapped his fingers on the table once. "We need his voice." Ava looked at him. "How?" Jesse pulled out his phone. "The office door wasn't fully closed when you heard him tonight, was it?" It had not been. "Then it might not be fully closed tomorrow night either," Jesse said. "People with habits tend to keep them." He was right. Dylan had the habit, which Ava had observed and attributed to simple distractedness, of not fully latching the door of his home office when he was inside it, particularly when he had company, because the illusion of privacy seemed to be enough for him. The belief that no one would pass by combined with the belief that Ava, if she did, would not investigate. Jesse had a small digital audio recorder that he used to record student presentations for later review, a common and unremarkable piece of classroom equipment. They decided that Ava would create an opportunity, on Thursday evening, for Dylan and Marcus to be together in the apartment in the same configuration as Wednesday night. A dinner suggestion, a reason for Marcus to come by. She would excuse herself early with a reasonable explanation, a headache, an early morning call with the wedding florist, and she would leave the recorder running on the hallway bookshelf between two stacks of books, positioned toward the office door, with a battery life of 6 hours. She did not know, when they made this plan, whether it would yield anything additional or whether Wednesday night's conversation had been a one-time moment of unusual candor. What she knew was that Dylan Carter believed he was untouchable and that the untouchable tend to be careless. They are careless because they have never had to be careful. That carelessness was the gap in the wall, and they were going to walk straight through it. Monday passed. Ava woke up and made coffee and sat across from Dylan at the kitchen table and talked about the weekend weather forecast and whether the outdoor portion of the reception should have the tent sides rolled down as a precaution, and she did it with a steadiness that cost her something she could not have quantified but that she paid without flinching. Dylan was in a good mood. He had a morning of client meetings, then an afternoon at the golf range with Marcus. Last pre-wedding outing, he said with a self-satisfied grin, and she smiled at the grin in the way she had always smiled at it, and said, "Have fun," and watched him go. She sat for a moment after the door closed. Then she washed both coffee cups, put them away, and went to work. Sitting at her desk in the downtown office, doing the work she was genuinely good at, she felt something clarify inside her that had been tangled since Wednesday night. This was hers. Her career, her intelligence, her ability to build something and make it work. None of it had ever actually depended on Dylan Carter. She had brought it all to the relationship. She was going to take it all back out. The clarity of that was almost a relief, in a way she had not expected. The grief was still there, enormous and real. But underneath it, or perhaps alongside it, was the bedrock of herself. It had not moved. Tuesday brought the rehearsal dinner. 50 people, a restaurant in Buckhead that Dylan had chosen specifically because several of his most significant investors frequented it, and he had wanted the pre-wedding evening to double as a visibility event, something he had framed to Ava as wanting the people who matter to us to be there, but which she now understood, with perfect clarity, for what it was. She sat at the head table beside him and let him reach for her hand, and she squeezed it back and smiled when people raised their glasses and said things about love and partnership and the future. Brooke gave a toast. It was warm and funny and specific to their friendship in ways that were entirely convincing, and that landed with everyone in the room as genuine. Ava watched her give it from across the table. She watched Brooke's confident ease, the practiced warmth of her delivery, the way she looked at Ava with apparent love and apparent happiness throughout. And she thought about 9 years. She thought about every time she had called Brooke at 2 in the morning when something was wrong. She thought about the emergency room and the career disappointments and the conversation about the man before Dylan where Brooke had said, accurately and generously, that Ava deserved someone who gave love freely rather than as a reward. She thought about all of that, and she looked at Brooke giving that toast, and she felt the grief of it move through her without expression. She had become very good at that, carrying things invisibly. It turned out to be a more useful skill than she had ever expected. Wednesday evening, she created the dinner occasion. She mentioned to Dylan over breakfast that Marcus had called her a small lie, manageable, the first dishonesty she had practiced in the entire relationship, to say he wanted to drop off a wedding gift before Saturday and ask if Thursday evening worked. Dylan had been pleased. She could see it in the immediate ease of his expression. Marcus was the person he was most himself around. She had understood that before Wednesday night in a general way. She understood it now in a specific and useful one. She set the recorder on the hallway shelf between a volume of design photography and a small ceramic jar they had bought at a market in Savannah on one of their weekend trips. She positioned it carefully, tested the angle, confirmed the battery. She made dinner for the three of them. Nothing elaborate, pasta and a good bottle of red. And at 8:30 she announced, with a convincing combination of regret and exhaustion, that she had a 6 a.m. call with the florist and needed to be in bed at a reasonable hour for once, pre-wedding or not. She kissed Dylan on the cheek. She said goodnight to Marcus. She went to the bedroom and sat in the dark and listened to the quiet of the apartment around her. Dylan and Marcus moved to the office, the way she had known they would. The door settled to its usual position, opened just enough. She did not go back to the hallway. She did not need to. The recorder was there. It was doing the work. In the morning, while Dylan showered, she retrieved it and sent the audio file to Jesse, who confirmed its clarity within the hour with a single text message. It's there. All of it. We're ready. Saturday arrived the way significant mornings always do, with a quality of light that feels different from ordinary light, as if the day itself is aware of its own weight. Ava had slept. Genuinely slept, which had surprised her, which had told her something important about where she was inside all of this. Not dissociated, not running on the kind of adrenaline that produces a brittle, surface-level calm that cracks without warning. She was rested, in the way of someone who has done what needed to be done to prepare and now simply needs to be present for what comes next. She lay in bed for a few minutes after she woke, listening to the sounds of the apartment, to Dylan in the shower, to the city coming to life outside the windows. She pressed both hands to her stomach. She had begun doing this every morning since Tuesday, a daily acknowledgement, private and deliberate. Good morning, she thought. Today is a big day. We're going to be okay. She believed it when she said it. That was the thing she needed you to understand about Ava Calloway on the morning of the wedding. She was not performing courage. She had arrived at something that was on the other side of fear, not the absence of fear, but the place you find when you have sat with fear long enough that it becomes simply a condition rather than a constraint. She was afraid, and she was going to do what she needed to do anyway. That is what courage actually is. She dressed simply for the drive to the hotel, jeans, a light sweater, her hair back in the way that was easiest to manage before the stylist got hold of it. She put the card from her overnight bag in the inside pocket of her bag, the card she had written to Dylan before she knew the truth, the one that said, "By the time you read this, you are already a father." She had thought about leaving it behind and ultimately decided to bring it. Not to give it to him, never that, but to have it with her as a reminder of something specific, that the love she had brought to this relationship and the joy she had felt in it, and the hope she had carried about the future, all of those things were real. They had existed. They had been genuinely hers. Nothing that Dylan had done could retroactively make them false. They were part of her history now, the complicated kind of history that doesn't resolve cleanly, but that belongs to you completely. She was keeping them. Her mother arrived at the hotel suite at 7:30, the way she had always arrived at important mornings in Ava's life. Earlier than required, coffee in hand, the particular combination of practical and tender that only mothers seem to be able to sustain simultaneously. Sandra Calloway looked at her daughter in the doorway of that suite, and her eyes went immediately soft, and she said nothing for a moment, just looked, and then said, "There you are." And Ava had walked into her mother's arms and held on for exactly the amount of time she needed to. And her mother had held back without saying anything, which was the right thing to do and which Sandra had always known how to do. Then they pulled apart, and Sandra looked at her daughter's face with the searching attention of a woman who has known her child for 31 years, and she said quietly, "Are you all right?" And Ava had said, "I will be." And she had meant it in every direction, not just forward, but sideways, through the next few hours, in the room that was coming, past all of it, and into the future that was already beginning to take shape. The suite filled gradually. Her two sisters, then the bridesmaids, then Brooke. Brooke arrived in a cloud of perfume and bright energy, her bridesmaid dress already on, a tote bag of emergency supplies over one arm, her hair in large rollers that she claimed gave her a full extra inch of volume. She swept into the room and hugged Ava at the door for a long second and said into her neck, "Today is your day, and it is going to be perfect." Ava hugged her back. She felt the familiar physical specificity of her height, the particular way she always hugged with her arms high, the smell of the perfume she'd worn for years. She felt the grief of it. She held it. She let Brooke go and smiled at her and said, "Let's get into it." And Brooke laughed and said, "Let's." The morning moved forward. Hair and makeup and photographs, and the zipper that required two people, and the shoes that needed a second layer of padding, and the small corrections and adjustments that turn a woman into a bride. The external ceremony of preparation that is itself a kind of ritual. Ava moved through all of it. At 10:15, with everyone occupied and the suite temporarily loud with its own activity, her phone buzzed once. A text from Jessie. "Position confirmed. Audio loaded. I'm in my seat. You're ready." She read it once, set the phone face down, and looked at herself in the full-length mirror. The woman looking back was wearing a $1,400 dress and a composure that had been built at considerable cost over 5 days and was now, in its finished form, genuinely beautiful. She was ready. She was more than ready. The estate in Buckhead had been built in the 1920s by a cotton merchant with a taste for European architecture and the money to indulge it. It had high stone walls and wooden doors that had absorbed the weight of a century and still held. And inside there were ceiling arches that caught sound in a particular way, not an echo, but an amplification, the way certain rooms hold what is said in them with more fidelity than ordinary rooms. 212 chairs had been arranged in the main hall, dressed in white and gold with the floral arrangements that Ava had chosen, hydrangeas and white roses, and the trailing greenery that the florist had described as romantic without being heavy. And at the far end of the room, there was an altar that Dylan had approved with the specific interest of a man who understands that the altar is where the photographs that last forever are taken. He was there. Ava's father confirmed it in a low voice as they stood together at the back of the hall waiting for the signal. "He's up there, sweetheart." And the warmth in Robert Calloway's voice was the warmth of a father who believed he was about to give his daughter to a man who deserved her. Ava squeezed her father's arm and did not correct him. There would be time for that conversation later, in a calmer setting, and it would be a different kind of conversation than he was currently imagining. The music began. The arrangement they had chosen together on a Sunday afternoon with a laptop and a bottle of wine, the memory of which was both tender and strange. The specific poignancy of remembering good moments that existed within a deception, of knowing that the afternoon had been real even if the person she had spent it with was not who she thought. The doors opened. The hall was full of faces turning, the way faces do when a bride appears at the back of a room. 212 people performing the particular collective attention of a wedding ceremony, the orientation of an entire room toward a moment it has been gathered to witness. Ava walked. She had always had a particular quality of stillness when she moved in high-stakes environments. Her colleagues had noted it over the years, the way she could walk into a difficult presentation room and find the center of herself before anyone else in the space had finished being anxious. She brought that now. She walked down the aisle on her father's arm, and she looked at Dylan the entire way, not because she needed to see him, but because she understood that the audience was watching both of them, and that what they saw from her needed to be entirely convincing for one more minute. Dylan's face did what it was supposed to do, the softening around the eyes, the slight parting of the lips, the carefully managed expression of a man who is performing being moved. She had seen it before. She now understood what it was. She held it with her gaze and kept walking. Her father kissed her cheek at the altar and held her hand for an extra second before he let go. It was not a long moment, but it was complete, and she carried it with her as she stepped up to face Dylan and took his hands and heard the officiant begin. "We are gathered here today to witness the union of Ava and Dylan." And the words filled the room with the amplifying quality of those old stone arches, and 212 people settled into the particular quiet of ceremony. Dylan's hands were warm. His grip was practiced. He looked at her with an expression that was designed to communicate devotion, and that, she now knew, communicated instead of very complete and utterly indifferent performance. She stood there with her hands in his, and her baby in her body, and the audio file loaded on Jesse's device in his breast pocket, and she breathed, once, with intention. The officiant spoke for 2 minutes about love and commitment and the sacred act of choosing another person. He used words that, under other circumstances, Ava would have found genuinely moving. She listened to them with the specific detachment of a person who is about to do something that cannot be undone and is certain it needs to be done. When the officiant paused and said, "The bride is asked to speak a few words before the vows," and the room responded with a warm, expectant murmur, Ava looked out at those 212 faces and she felt, for the first time since Wednesday night, completely calm. "I need to share something with all of you," she said, "and I need everyone in this room to hear it clearly." Her voice was steady. It was not loud. She did not need it to be loud, because the arches of the room did the work, carrying her words to every corner without effort, the way the room had been built to do. Dylan's expression shifted. The shift was subtle, but she caught it. The first micro-crack in the performance, the millisecond of recalibration as his mind registered that something was moving in a direction he had not planned for. His hands, still holding hers, tensed almost imperceptibly. She could feel it. She held his hands a moment longer, deliberately, and then she released them. She reached into the small floral bag on the altar railing and removed the folded sheet of paper she had placed there herself during the venue setup the previous evening. She unfolded it without looking at it. She did not need to read it. She had written it herself on Thursday morning after listening to the audio file for the second time, transcribing the most significant passages in her own handwriting, confirming that every word was accurate and would stand on its own. "5 nights ago," she said, "I was walking through our apartment when I heard a conversation that was not meant for me." The room was completely still, the kind of still that a large group of people can only achieve together when something has commanded their collective attention so completely that every individual impulse to shift or whisper or reach for a phone has simply stopped. She looked at Jesse. He reached into his breast pocket and activated the device, and Dylan Carter's voice filled the estate in Buckhead, filled it through the venue audio system that the technician had prepared, filled those stone arches the way the arches had been built to carry sound, reached every face in every chair with the clarity of a man who had believed he was speaking in private. Ava's perfect for the role. Sweet, devoted, and completely clueless. The room did not react immediately. There was a beat, 2 beats, in which the words arrived and were absorbed, and the processing happened. The moment when 212 minds simultaneously understood what they were hearing and what it meant. Then the room began to change. Slowly at first, a movement in the front rows, a turning of heads, a sharp intake of breath from somewhere on the groom's side. Then faster, as more of the recording played, as the words about Brooke arrived and landed, as the plan for the prenup and the casual forward planning for the exit took shape in the air of the room and became impossible to interpret as anything other than what they were. Dylan's face had gone through several stages. The first was the completion of the recalibration, the performance dropping away not gradually, but in one moment, like a stage set that collapses all at once. What was underneath it was not guilt and not grief. It was calculation. The rapid calculation of a man assessing damage and looking for angles. He opened his mouth. The audio was still playing. Whatever he said was absorbed by the sound filling the room. He moved toward her. She stepped back. 1 step, controlled, deliberate. His hand reached for nothing. Brooke, in the front row of the bride's side in her bridesmaid dress with her bouquet in her lap, and her carefully styled hair, and the confident warmth she had sustained through an entire morning of being the best friend of the woman she had betrayed, had gone the color of dry plaster. She was looking at the floor with the particular fixity of a person who has run out of performances. Marcus, standing at the altar as best man, was examining his shoes. Several of Dylan's investors, identifiable by the specific quality of their suits and the fact that Dylan had personally walked Ava through each of them at various points. "This is Richard. He's with the development fund. That's Paul. He's been with us since the Peachtree Project. We're doing the thing that powerful men do when they feel the floor shift. Very carefully doing nothing. Watching with the alert and neutral attention of people who are deciding what this will mean for them. The audio finished. The room held its silence for another 2 seconds that felt much longer than 2 seconds. Then Ava folded the paper and returned it to her bag, with the same deliberate care with which she had removed it, and looked at Dylan directly. "I am not going to marry you today," she said. She said it without elevation, without tremor, without anything other than the clean and final quality of a decision that has already been made and is simply now being announced. "And I want everyone in this room to know something." She turned, just slightly, to take in the full breadth of the audience. This is not a woman breaking. This is not a porcelain doll. She held that phrase in the air for 1 second. She watched Dylan's face when he understood that she had heard everything. Not just the betrayal, but that specific word, his specific assessment of her fragility. Something moved across his face in that second that she had never seen there before. This is a woman choosing herself. She picked up her bouquet. She stepped down from the altar platform. She walked back down the aisle the way she had come, not hurrying, not looking back, not performing distress for an audience that needed to see her without it. Walking with the straightness and the pace of a woman who knows exactly where she is going. Behind her, the room was no longer quiet. Behind her, it was becoming something that none of the people in it would forget for the rest of their lives. She reached the doors. The morning came in. She walked through it. Jesse was in the parking lot when she came out. He had slipped through the side exit at the moment the audio began, moving with the quiet efficiency of a man who had planned his exit the way he had planned everything else in the past 5 days, precisely and without drawing attention to himself. He was standing beside the car with his jacket in one hand and an expression on his face that was not triumph. It was something quieter and more solid than triumph. It was the look of a man who has done a necessary thing and is now ready for whatever is next. He had stopped at the hotel coffee cart on the way out of the venue, a detail that struck Ava later as so characteristic of him that she would smile remembering it, and had a cup of tea ready, because on their second night in the diner, he had observed her order tea, and he had been paying attention. She took it without comment. They got in the car. He drove. For the first few minutes, neither of them spoke, and the silence was not uncomfortable. It was the specific shared silence of two people who have come through something together and are now simply present with the fact of having come through it. The city moved past the windows in its Saturday morning configuration, traffic lighter than weekdays, people visible on sidewalks with the particular ease of weekend mornings. Ava held her tea in both hands. She pressed her back against the seat and felt, for the first time in 5 days, the full weight of her own exhaustion. Her phone had been in her bag during the ceremony and in the minutes immediately following. When she looked at it now, the screen showed 17 missed calls and over 40 text messages, arriving in a compressed rush that represented the speed at which a room full of connected people communicates information that compels them to reach outward. Her mother had called 3 times. Her sisters twice each. Numbers she didn't recognize, friends of guests, she assumed, people who had been in the room and had found her number through mutual contacts with the specific urgency of people who need to say they witnessed something. She turned the phone face down on her knee and looked out the window. "He's going to make calls," she said. "I know," Jesse said. "By this afternoon, he'll have a version of events. Let him." She meant it. She had thought about this in the planning stage, about Dylan's capacity for narrative management, about his access to people whose loyalty was purchased rather than earned, and who would therefore be available for repurchase once the price became clear. She had thought about the fact that for some of the people in that room, his professional standing would be more durable than their instinct to believe what they had heard with their own ears, because some people always find a way to explain away the evidence when the alternative is too inconvenient. She had made her peace with that. She did not need every person in that room to walk out transformed. She needed the room itself to have happened. It had happened. That was permanent now. Nothing Dylan said in the days ahead could reach back and unhappen it. That was enough. She called her mother from the car. Sandra Calloway picked up on the first ring, and what she said was not "what happened" or "are you all right?" It was, immediately and simply, "I'm at the hotel. Come." Ava said, "I'm on my way," and ended the call. She turned to Jesse. "Will you drive me to my mother?" He had already changed direction without being asked. That was Jesse, always already doing the next right thing by the time you thought to name it. She looked at his profile for a moment. The specific certainty of his expression, the quality of presence he had, the fact that he had gotten up at 1 in the morning and driven to a diner and sat across from her and said I'm in without a single calculation about what it would cost him within his own family. Thank you, she said. He shook his head slightly, the way people do when they want to say that gratitude is unnecessary without dismissing it. I should have done something sooner, he said. It doesn't matter now, she said. It does to me. They rode the rest of the way in the specific, comfortable quiet of two people who have established, through a crisis, something genuine. She arrived at the hotel to find her mother already waiting at the entrance with her coat on. Sandra Calloway took one look at her daughter coming across the lobby in a wedding dress with a bouquet in her hand and tears. She was not crying, and a composure that was somehow both intact and clearly costing something. And she simply opened her arms, and Ava walked into them. And for a long moment, that was everything. The human capacity for compartmentalization is remarkable and not always healthy, but in the days immediately following a large emotional rupture, it can be a mercy, the mind's way of rationing the pain into portions that can be survived. Ava experienced this in the week after the wedding that wasn't. Not numbness. She was clear with herself about the difference, having navigated enough difficult emotional territory in her life to understand that numbness and functional grief are not the same thing. She was grieving, actively, every day, in the specific and inconvenient and nonlinear way that grief actually works, which bears no resemblance to the tidy stages that people sometimes describe. She would wake up feeling clear and purposeful, and by mid-morning find herself in the parking lot of the grocery store sitting in her car with her forehead against the steering wheel, because something small had triggered the specific memory of the 2 years she had given to something that had been, in important ways, a lie. She would have evenings of total clarity and peace, and then hours of sudden anger so clean and complete it surprised her with its own authority. She let all of it move through her. She did not narrate it on social media. She did not reach out to the mutual friends who were requesting audiences with the story. She processed it in the private way, which was the only way she had ever known how to process things that mattered. Dylan's public response materialized within 48 hours of the ceremony, as she had predicted. He released a statement through a professional PR contact, a sign, if any were needed, of exactly who he was, that his first instinct after a personal collapse of this kind was to engage reputation management rather than to reflect on what he had done. That described the events at the ceremony as a private misunderstanding that had been taken out of context and expressed his hope for peace and privacy for everyone involved. The phrase taken out of context was the one that made Ava laugh, briefly and without warmth, when she read it. Context. She had given him weeks of context. She had given him 2 years of context. The audio had given 212 additional people 4 minutes of extremely unambiguous context. Marcus, the best man, went quiet on all platforms and did not surface publicly for several weeks. Brooke sent a text message on day 3 that attempted to occupy the territory between apology and explanation without fully committing to either. Ava read it once and set the phone down, as she had planned to do, and attended to the actual work of the days in front of her. She had a life to rebuild. The rebuilding was more interesting to her than the accounting. Her obstetrician appointment was on Wednesday of the first week, 10 days after the morning of the wedding. The baby was healthy, 8 weeks along, developing precisely as it should, apparently unconcerned with the disruption of the external circumstances and proceeding with the business of becoming according to its own schedule, which Ava found both humbling and fortifying. The doctor, who had been her OB for 3 years and knew her well enough to understand that the context of this visit was more complicated than a standard prenatal, asked her simply and without pressure how she was doing. Ava said, "I'm doing the work." The doctor nodded. "What do you need from me?" Ava told her. They made a plan. They set the next appointments. She walked out of the office into the afternoon sun and stood on the sidewalk for a moment with her face up, the way she sometimes did when she needed to feel that the world was larger than the immediate problem, when she needed the reminder that life continues past the boundaries of any single story. It continued. She could feel it. She moved through it, toward the car, toward the next thing. She filed the apartment paperwork within the week, as she had planned. The lease had been in both their names since they moved in together 14 months ago, and extricating herself from it was cleaner than it might have been. Dylan, faced with the specific consequences of 212 witnesses to his own recorded words, had retained a lawyer, but had also, through that lawyer, communicated a willingness to manage the practical separations without additional conflict. It was the calculation of a man who understood that his leverage was now minimal and who was protecting the remainder of his assets rather than fighting over the dissolution. Ava's attorney, a woman she had been referred to by a colleague who described her as the most practical person in a crisis I have ever met, confirmed that there was nothing to contest and that the separation of their shared arrangements would proceed on the accelerated schedule Ava had requested. The shared financial entanglements turned out to be fewer and simpler than they might have been. Dylan had not yet had the opportunity to implement the post-marriage financial strategies he had described so casually to Marcus, which meant that Ava was walking away with everything that was already hers and nothing less. She chose a new apartment in a neighborhood she had always loved. She decorated it herself, slowly, with the specific pleasure of a woman choosing things because she wants them rather than because they will look good to a specific audience. There is a particular grief in the ending of a long friendship that people do not always speak about with the same seriousness they give to the ending of a romantic relationship. Perhaps because the cultural vocabulary for friendship loss is thinner, or because we assume that the depth of pain is proportional to the romantic nature of the bond. But the research does not support that assumption. Studies of women who have experienced the loss of a long-term close friendship through betrayal report levels of what psychologists term relational grief that are comparable in intensity to the grief of romantic separation, particularly when the friendship has lasted longer than 5 years and has been the primary source of emotional support through significant life events. 9 years. The bridal shower. The emergency room. The conversation about the man before Dylan where Brooke had said precisely the thing that Ava had needed to hear. Ava held all of that. She did not minimize it. She did not tell herself it had been worthless because it ended in betrayal. The warmth was real. The loyalty had been real for much of it, and the loss of it was real in a way that deserved to be grieved fully and without abbreviation. She grieved it. In private. In the car, and in the shower, and in the late evening hours when her apartment was quiet, and the specific absence of that friendship made itself felt in the particular way that absences do, by occupying exactly the space the thing they replaced had occupied and making that space visible. Brooke's text message on day 3 had been long. 11 paragraphs, carefully constructed, threading a needle between apology and self-explanation that Ava recognized immediately as the work of someone who had spent a significant amount of time crafting something that was designed to produce a specific emotional response. The apology was present in it, but it was framed, surrounded by context that was meant to soften it, to complicate it, to introduce the possibility of interpretation that might leave room for something that could be called understanding and might eventually become forgiveness, or at least access. Ava read it once, beginning to end. She identified each element of it with the clear and now entirely dispassionate attention of a woman who had spent 2 weeks in the company of her own grief and had come out the other side of it clear-eyed. She set the phone down. She did not respond that day. She did not respond the next day or the day after that. She took the time she needed not because she was punishing Brooke with silence, but because she needed to be certain, when she did respond, that what she said was what she actually meant and not a version of something she had written in the heat of a feeling that had since settled. When she responded, it was brief and complete. She said that she understood that Brooke had her own reasons for the choices she had made. She said that she was not going to carry hatred for her. She said that the friendship was over and that she wished Brooke well. She said nothing unkind. She meant everything she wrote. The question that Ava was asked most often in the months after the wedding, by the people who knew her well enough to ask it without it being intrusive, her mother, her sisters, the colleagues who had been genuine friends rather than simply professional contacts, was some version of the same thing. How are you really? Not the social version of that question, not the one that is satisfied by, I'm fine, I'm moving forward, but the version that wants an honest answer. She gave honest answers, as she always had. The honest answer changed as the months moved forward. In the first weeks it was exhausted, clear, more functional than I expected. In the second month it was grieving the relationship, not the person, which was a distinction that took time to understand but that, once understood, was illuminating. She was mourning the version of her future she had imagined, the life that had been outlined and partially built and then had to be disassembled. She was not mourning Dylan Carter, or not the real Dylan Carter, the one she now understood him to be. There is a difference between grieving a person and grieving the idea of them, and the difference matters because one path leads somewhere and the other goes in circles. She had chosen the path that led somewhere. By the third month, she was feeling something that she had not expected to feel, and that surprised her with its persistence. Lighter, not unburdened. That would be too simple, too quick, too tidy for something that had actually cost her a great deal. But lighter in the specific way of a woman who has put down something she had been carrying for longer than she realized. 2 years of managing the subtle, constant work of making herself fit a relationship that she now understood had never actually been built around who she was. 2 years of intuitions filed away in a drawer. 2 years of the low-level vigilance that people maintain when they are, without knowing it, surrounded by something that requires management. She had not known she was working that hard. She understood now that she had been. And not having to work that hard anymore. Being in her own apartment, making her own decisions, accountable only to herself and the child she was growing and the work she was genuinely proud of, felt like a loosening of something she had been braced against for so long that bracing had become invisible. She had thought, sometimes, in the hardest of the early weeks, that she might never feel light again. She had been wrong about that. She was very glad to have been wrong about that. The last piece of this story belongs to the night in early October, about 3 months after the wedding that wasn't, when Ava Calloway sat on the back porch of her mother's house in Charlotte on a visit home and told her mother, under a sky that had gone to full dark and was doing what October skies do in the South, vast and clear and starred in a way that city skies rarely allow, that she thought she was going to be all right. Not as a reassurance, not as the performance of recovery for an audience that needed to feel better about her. She said it because she had arrived at it, genuinely, through the specific and unglamorous work of the preceding months, through the grief and the anger and the rebuilding and the small daily choices to be present for her own life rather than absent from it. Her mother had reached across the porch railing and taken her hand and held it. The way Sandra Calloway had been holding Ava's hand since she was small enough to fit her whole hand inside 2 of her mother's fingers, and she had not said anything at first, because there are moments when the right response is simply to be there, and she had always known those moments. After a while she said, "You were always going to be all right. I just had to watch you find out." Ava had laughed at that, the quiet kind of laugh that contained something real, and had looked out at the yard where she had grown up and thought about how far she had come from it, and how much she had brought back. She was 5 months pregnant by then. The baby was a girl. She had found out on a Tuesday afternoon, in the same matter-of-fact clinical room where she had been receiving her prenatal care, and the sonographer had said, "Do you want to know?" And Ava had said yes without hesitation, and the woman had said, "It's a girl," and something in Ava's chest had done something complicated and complete all at once. A girl. She had driven home from that appointment with both hands on the wheel and the October light coming through the car windows in slanted afternoon angles, and she had thought about what she wanted for her daughter. Not the external things, though those mattered. The internal things, the things that would carry this child through the world, that would be with her when no one was looking, that would determine the kind of woman she became in the private rooms of her own life. She wanted her daughter to know her own worth without having to learn it through loss. She wanted her to trust her instincts early and fiercely. She wanted her to understand, as a foundational fact rather than a late and costly discovery, that her love was not a currency to be accepted by whoever offered an acceptable performance of deserving it, that her love was something rare and serious and worth protecting, worth offering only to those who showed up for it over time and in the difficult moments rather than just in the warm and easy ones. She wanted her daughter to know all of this from the beginning, and she intended to show her, every day, by living it. That is not a small thing. It is, in fact, everything. Jesse remained in her life. He checked in regularly, not intrusively, not with the frequency that requires management, but with the consistency of someone who has decided that a person matters to them and is demonstrating that decision through small, reliable actions. A text on a Thursday that said nothing except, "Hope your week is good." A recommendation for a pediatrician that 2 of his teacher colleagues had used and trusted. A show-up-in-person moment in late August, when he drove to Atlanta with a casserole that his mother had made. Not for Ava, he was careful to say, but for Ava's freezer, for the weeks after the baby arrived when cooking was going to be low on the list of available attentions. She had looked at him standing on her doorstep with a casserole dish wrapped in a kitchen towel and had felt, in that moment, the full weight of gratitude, not the polite kind, not the obligatory acknowledgement of a favor, but the real kind that lives in the body and comes with the understanding that you have been genuinely seen and genuinely supported by a person who chose to be both of those things without being asked. She thought sometimes about Jesse, about what he was, about the kind of man who gets up at 1 in the morning for someone who needed him, who organizes his brother's accountability without making it about himself, who brings a casserole and says it isn't for you, it's for your freezer. She thought about what it meant to finally be able to recognize that kind of person clearly, the realness of it, the uncomplicated quality of someone who was simply who they appeared to be. It felt, after 2 years of the alternative, like being able to breathe all the way. Ava's daughter was born on a Wednesday in early January, at 6:52 in the morning, which Ava would note was approximately the same hour that she typically got up to get ready for work, and which she took as a small and private sign that this was a child who would have things to accomplish and would not be wasting mornings. She was healthy and loud and looked, in the first bewildering hours of her life, like the most particular and specific person Ava had ever seen, already fully herself, already recognizable as someone. Sandra Calloway was in the room, at Ava's right. Her sister Claire was at her left. Jesse was in the waiting room down the hall, where he had been since 3 in the morning, and where, when the nurse went out to tell him, he apparently put his face in both hands for a moment in the way that people do when they have been holding something tightly for a long time and are now allowed to let it go. Ava had asked Jesse to be in the waiting room, not because she had expectations about what came next, or because she had organized the future in her mind into any particular shape, but because he was someone she trusted, and because having a person she trusted on the other side of the door felt like the right thing. She was learning to build her life around people she trusted. It turned out to be a much simpler way to live than the alternative. She intended to keep doing it. The name she had chosen for her daughter was Eleanor. Not a name from either family, not a name with a complicated backstory. A name she had always loved, privately, the way you hold preferences that belong entirely to you before you have someone to share them with. Eleanor. She had looked at her daughter in those first hours and said the name, and the baby had made the particular indeterminate sound that newborns make, which Ava chose to interpret as agreement. Eleanor Calloway, not Carter. She had made that decision months ago, quietly and without drama, and it had felt right in the way that the truest decisions tend to feel, not like a choice you made, but like a fact you finally acknowledged. Eleanor Calloway was going to grow up with her mother's name and her mother's surname and her mother's understanding, which was this, that the women who move through the world with the most integrity are not the ones who were never deceived. They are the ones who were deceived and still chose, on the other side of it, to believe in the worth of real connection, who learned to tell the difference between love and performance, between depth and surface, between the person who shows up for you in a diner at 1 in the morning and the person who tells you beautifully that you are his home while planning his exit, who learned the difference and then, with that knowledge, chose to build something real. Ava Calloway was that woman. She had always been that woman. It just took a hallway and a wedding and a decision made in a bathroom mirror for her to know it without question. Eleanor was going to know it from the beginning. That was the gift. That was what all of it, in the end, had been building toward. Not an ending. A starting point. The truest one Ava had ever had.